Welcome back to our virtual Sunday school class with Pastor Grant and Pastor Nate, and we're going through Abraham Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism, and we've appreciated the feedback we've gotten so far. Hope you guys are still reading it yourself, listening to it yourself, and then coming to these conversations only after you've engaged with the content yourself. And again, ask us questions. I've enjoyed some of the conversations I've had, but you post something publicly, somebody else, it might embolden them to ask their question, and we can see who's going through. You can see who's going through it, so that you can talk about it at church and all that kind of stuff. So this was a great lecture.
This one surprised me.
Because you didn't think it was going to be one of your favorites, and it was?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
Exactly.
Yeah, I thought the same thing.
When it comes to religion and even politics, I think the first time I listened to these, the politics chapter was the most eye-opening.
Right.
Literally, I didn't remember a bit of this chapter. Reading it through again, I was already expecting that stuff at the beginning. And then going through this, it just was surprising.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there that I forgot. And
There's actually a book, I'll recommend it now, but it made me think of, I don't know if you've read this, but A Different Shade of Green by Gordon Wilson.
I have not read it.
It's really good. I can lend it to you before I lend it to anybody else. But it's really good, and it kind of reminded me, you could tell he's a Kuyper guy, and he got a lot out of this lecture. But so Calvinism and Science, I think in this lecture, Kuyper kind of shows the impact that Calvinism has had on science.
Yep.
And he kind of argues that Calvinism and the Calvinistic worldview that we're talking about has impacted science in basically four ways, right?
Yep.
So he goes on, it says, it fosters a love for science.
Yeah.
It's restored the full domain of science. It set it free from its unnatural bonds, and it solved what Kuyper calls the sort of unavoidable scientific conflict.
Right.
And those are the four things that he thinks Calvinism has done for science, and we'll just kind of maybe go through them as we go through this chronologically. I think we're going to hit each one. So the first thing that Calvinism does for science is it fosters a love for science, right?
Yes.
He kind of talks about how the love for science is bound up in the character of God,
right,
and the creative power of God.
Right. And so you don't realize, this is what surprised me, just going through this again, was you don't realize that predestination applies to science. But if you think about it, you've adopted this worldview that God is sovereign over all, that God is predestined to all things.
Right.
So then you can study things in creation, and then you can do the same process again, which is our scientific method, and you're going to get the same results.
Right.
And you just never realize that God's predestinating power and acts is what kind of fuels a desire. Like, well, what else could I study and see the same result happen every time I do it?
That's right.
This is unbelievable. I think about kids. Kids do the same thing over and over again and are just fascinated that the same result happens every single time.
That's right.
But when he says it, this Calvinistic teaching of God's sovereignty and his predestinating acts fuels a love for science, it was surprising, like I keep saying, but it was really cool.
It's I agree. He says on page 114, he says, you recognize that the cosmos, instead of being a heap of stones loosely thrown together, on the contrary, presents to our mind a monumental building erected in a severely consistent style.
Right.
Right. And he says that in talking about only a world where God has sovereignly ordained all things that take place is the kind of world that has scientific laws that can even be studied.
Right.
Right. Like the fact that he has built his character into the creational order is why we can study scientific laws like gravity and all these kinds of things. That's the only reason. Right. And I just thought that was it's cool. You don't think about it in that way.
Yes.
You're like, yes.
I was trying to find the quote here I wanted to say, but it takes you from the teaching of salvation, which is normally what we think of God's sovereignty and his predestination.
Yep.
And it brings us out into just all of creation, and it encompasses everything, which is what all of this book is about, is a full Christian world and life view. And so cool.
he says, this is another one on page 115 as he's coming to the end of this kind of first section, but he says, faith in such a unity, stability, and order of things, personally as predestination, cosmically as the counsel of God's decree, could not but awaken as with a loud voice and vigorously foster love for science.
Exactly.
And that's it, right? Like, so it's God's, and it's just cool when you think about this, right? So we think about God's law and God's decrees. And even when you think through it, I was just thinking about this because I was like, yeah, I do love God's creation and I do love learning new things about the world. I love watching those like Planet Blue and Blue Earth and all that kind of stuff. Riot and the Dance is even better because it's,
1 and 2.
We should just plug that because like
Yes.
Riot and the Dance 1 and 2 are phenomenal.
Yeah.
You can go to riotandthedance.com. We were actually set to be one of the places that screened Riot and the Dance 2 right before COVID hit at the end of March. So we should still just do like a church family movie night or whatever and watch that because it's so good. But the idea here is that God spoke, right? And his words going into the world are what created all things. And so there's not one molecule in the world that isn't doing what God told it to do.
Right.
And that's how we can have uniformity in nature. It's not just loosely connected things that are evolved because of chance and accident.
Yeah.
We don't live in a world of cosmic accidents. We live in the theater of God's glory.
And he does get into that later, but just like what you said, there's then truly, or at least there shouldn't be, any motivation to do science if you do believe in an evolutionary worldview, because none of it makes sense. And even the presupposition of things coming out the same every time, you have no foundation for.
Right.
But God's sovereignty does provide that foundation, which is kind of the foundation of presuppositional apologetics.
That's right.
God is that precondition that makes sense of everything.
And without it, every presupposition that we make, it's funny that, there's apologists or presuppositional apologists who talk about how like you can't draw breath to refute God's truth that he hasn't given to you. Right. And that's kind of the point with science is you have no foundation to observe anything and assume that your observation means anything.
Or to make any conclusions on it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
He has a good quote on page 116. He says, "And who is there who does not perceive what entirely new impulse to undertake scientific investigations had to grow out of the newborn Calvinism, which with one powerful grasp brought order out of chaos, putting under discipline so dangerous a spiritual licentiousness, making an end to that halting between two or more opinions, and showing us instead of rising and falling mists," so that would be that evolutionary, just no substance there, "the picture of a powerfully rushing mountain stream taking its course through a well-regulated bed towards an ocean which awaits to receive it."
So good.
So picturesque.
Yeah,
but it's just awesome that scientific study under that sovereignty of God and under that presupposition of God's predestinating act is like this beautiful, powerfully rushing stream down into an ocean of discovery.
Yeah.
So cool.
It's, I was thinking about how, I can't remember what documentary I watched this one time. It was talking about how the earth, have you ever heard the fine tuning of the earth arguments for kind of
teleological?
Yeah. So there's this idea that, the earth is finely tuned for life, right? Our distance from the sun, the size of our moon, the distance of our moon from the earth.
So the single cell organ, our cell, like you can't break down. I think it's Michael Behe. Like
in Darwin's Black Box when he's talking about things that are irreducibly complex and all that. There you go. So you have all this like fine tuning of the earth in terms of where, like even where we are in the galaxy, right? Like the situation for Earth and where we are in the galaxy. All of this is fine tuned for life on Earth, but it's also perfectly tuned for scientific discovery. So like I'll just give you one example that I think is super cool. So the sun is approximately 400 times bigger than the moon. Okay, so about 400 moons fit inside the sun.
Right.
But the sun is also 400 times further away from Earth than the sun. All right? And the reason that's important is because during a lunar eclipse, the moon perfectly blocks out the sun.
Right.
And everything that we know about what makes up the gases of the sun and the solar flares on the sun's surface are because they can be observed during a lunar eclipse. So we wouldn't know everything that we know about the sun if those two things weren't perfectly aligned. The how much bigger the sun is than the moon and how further away it is. Because then if it was bigger, we wouldn't be able to see the activity on the sun's surface. And if it was smaller, the light from the sun would still make it impossible for us to actually see what we're looking at. So it's actually finely tuned for us to make scientific discovery, which is just amazing that God has fine-tuned it. Like the fact that we have a transparent atmosphere, right? We're the only planet in our solar system that has a transparent atmosphere, so that we can see the stars, that we can see, just amazing stuff that God has given us this great world to discover.
Right. I mean, even all the building and digging up ore and all that other stuff throughout the millennia that we've done, just because of holy curiosity.
That's right.
I wonder what I could do with that chunk of something.
Let's
see what God's given us that for.
Well, and that's exactly it, right? Is there's no point in doing that. You're just getting lucky, as opposed to assuming, right? The underlying assumption that God has ordained all these things, and so there is a cure for that disease in that rainforest, right? It's like the fact that atheistic medical scientists are going off into the rainforest to find a cure for these diseases is ludicrous,
right? Which is what he says
in
later.
A purposeless universe, right? Yeah. Sorry.
No, he says that later. I know we're jumping ahead, and I'm holding back right now comments about just the task of taking dominion. Yeah, he talks about that a little bit. Yeah, later.
Okay, so let's not go too far.
Yeah.
Because the second thing impact that Calvinism has had on the field of science is Calvinism restored science's domain, as Kuyper says.
Right.
So he says on page 118, Christendom, it must be confessed, did not escape this error. A dualistic conception of regeneration was the cause of the rupture between the life of nature and the life of grace. It has, on account of its too intense contemplation of celestial things, neglected to give due attention to the world of God's creation. So basically what he's saying is that early on, even the Christians were getting this wrong, where we elevate the spiritual, the celestial, the ethereal, and sort of denigrate or downgrade God's creational order.
Right. And during the Middle Ages, the sciences were under the purview of the church.
Right.
And the church wrongly controlled what would be published or what would be studied and that sort of thing.
They needed state sovereignty, or sphere sovereignty, man.
Yeah, it's needed to be. Yeah. But this was 1,000 years late. But and then the system with the Roman Catholic Church was that you needed to get as much merit as possible in your life.
Right. And
studying earth, studying material things was not meritorious, right?
Meritorious, yeah.
And so it was discarded. It was unimportant. It was, and that was that dualistic mindset.
Yeah.
Gnostic tendency.
Yep.
To overemphasize, like you said, the spiritual rather than the material, not realizing that both are intertwined.
Right.
And so that Calvinism brought that back, brought science back to that domain of something that is important. Creation is important.
Because all of the created order is under the sovereign control of God.
Right. And I think the incarnation and then the resurrection are the theological proofs or the pointers to us that, hey, the material world matters and it's going to be regenerated, which is what is the terminology Kuyper uses.
Right.
That's something that needs to be made new and redeemed.
That's right.
And it was Calvinism that brought that back.
Right. So he kind of summarizes this on, I don't know, we're skipping ahead to kind of the end of this part, but he says on 125, a Calvinist who seeks God does not for a moment think of limiting himself to theology and contemplation, leaving the other sciences, as of a lower character in the hands of the unbelievers, but on the contrary, looking upon it as his task to know God in all of his works, he is conscious of having been called to fathom with all the energy of his intellect things terrestrial as well as things celestial. Like, boom, there's
Good.
Right?
Yeah. I had a small note as I was going through this, and I wrote, "We are not dualists." That's like so
get that
helpful.
t-shirt.
Yeah, well, I'm not a dualist. But when we talk about creation and God's intentions with it, and when it comes to the sciences, obviously you practice science under sovereignty and lordship of God, but then we're not dualists, and so it is important. It just kind of flows from there,
right,
and from the work of Christ.
And that is the tragedy of dualism, is I guess it's the idea that it abandons, as he says there, it abandons the sciences into the hands of the unbelievers.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, that's what's happened, right? Like, you look at the science classes of the public education system, which most Christians are still going through. They come out, and it's no wonder they struggle with the idea of God's sovereignty, God's creational norms, because they've been fed this idea that we're all just protoplasm bobbing on the surface of the cosmos for so long, because Christians have abandoned the work of the sciences for the more lofty, the more theological, the more important stuff.
Yeah, and the other sad part of that is then Christian scientists a lot of times almost assume they're the crazy one, and they have to sort of prove themselves.
Right.
And so they come out with studies or discover things, and rather than taking just the positive stance of this is God's world and we're just going to discover it and enjoy it, they too often publish articles or something like, look, we're not crazy. I found this, fossil or something.
And this proves the one, like,
right.
Yeah.
So start taking me serious, world. It's like, it should be flipped, at least as far as the, the idea there.
It's like because we're playing catch up, the Christians all come out with a sort of defensive posture first.
Right. That should be flipped. The posture should be flipped.
That's right. This is God's world. Prove it isn't.
Yeah,
right? Like,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The other thing he talks about common grace here, where sin has certainly marred and kind of twisted our world, and so we have sickness, death, and on and on. But because of God's restraining common grace in the world, and he points out Plato and Cicero as still writing things that are very beneficial.
Right.
And that's how we can still see the evolutionist doctor still come up with something that's beneficial for all mankind.
Right.
It's because God, though sin has permeated all things, God's common grace has restrained it such that it doesn't destroy all things.
Right.
Without God's restraining common grace, it would.
Yeah.
But then that still brings out all these, developments of medicines or what have you.
Yeah.
But
and I guess this is the point, is how much, and we'll get to this at
well,
the
that's
end
where,
too, is how much better, right, would it be if those who were leading in scientific and medical discoveries were people with a Christian worldview who assumed the right things.
Right.
I keep getting ahead of ourselves.
I know, because that's like the next section, right?
Yeah.
I think.
So then I guess his third point here is that Calvinism sets science free, right?
Oh, yeah.
So he talks about how he kind of traces the rise of the university and how it was eventually subjugated to the authority of the Pope and the Vatican, which is what you were talking about. He says on page 128, Rome did oppose not only the church, did oppose not only in the church what was right, but also beyond its boundaries, freedom of the world.
Right.
And he says he goes into a couple things. He talks about René Descartes, who, as he puts it on page 129, had to leave the Roman Catholic France, found among the Calvinists of the Netherlands a safe retreat. Right. Nice. So like so there's this idea that science was held captive by, quite honestly, an overbearing church, right? So last week we talked about an overbearing government, right? Yeah. What happens when the church tries to swallow up things that are not within its sphere,
right?
And that's not to say God, right? This is the whole thing. Like, let's not sorry.
Yeah,
you
he
got
had a
something
good
there.
quote at the beginning of the section saying this, that science needs this indispensable liberty, but he says this does not mean that science is entirely untrammeled in the use of its liberty and need obey no laws.
Right.
On the contrary, a fish lying on dry land is perfectly free to die and perish,
Yeah.
while a fish, which really shall be free to live and to thrive, must be entirely surrounded by water and guided by its fins. And so we'd say science would be surrounded and guided by still God's word, God's creational
That's right.
law, and still the word of God, but not the church leadership or government leadership dictating what it can and can't do.
That's right.
It needs to have freedom under the sovereignty of God to study his creation.
And that's where, like, if you just think about this practically, what does that mean? That means pastors in the pulpit ought to be lighting the fire of love for God's creational world in such a way that those who are in our congregations in medicine take that love and that Calvinistic worldview into medicine, and that the lawyers into law, and the educators into education.
Right.
So the idea is not that the church mandates and oversees all of those things, but teaches the theology that is required in order to thrive in God's world in those various areas.
And so one implication of that would be the pastor would be preaching the 10 Commandments to the scientist sitting in the pew and would hear, thou shalt not murder. So then when they go study, vaccines or whatever, then aborted babies' cells are never going to be part of what they use.
That's right.
In developing anything.
Right.
Because they know God says, thou shalt not murder, so we don't use that.
Right. So we're taking God's ethic into God's world in that sphere.
But it would be the pastor at least preaching the word.
Right.
And then they would go under that sovereignty with the word in their heart now, would go conduct their science freely under God's sovereignty.
Right. Accountable to God.
Right.
Right. All that. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's good. All right. So do you have any other thoughts or quotes from this idea that Calvinism sets science free?
I don't think so.
Okay. But it's a pretty, it kind of falls in line with everything that we've been talking about in terms of...
it pretty much follows when you got Calvinism and religion, Calvinism and politics.
Right.
That universities should be completely free to study as they desire. And most people will go, well, what if they... And you go, okay, well, think about it. If the government is properly executing justice, and then if the church is properly preaching and teaching as they should, then whoever's running the university or whoever's studying at the university would have those two things properly restraining and guiding, not being overbearing, and would regulate. Everything kind of works together.
Right. So they should be free. There should be liberty here. Like this is, it's just a common theme because again, we're living in a world, we keep saying this, we're living in a world of such over-regulation. It's hard to imagine a school where the government doesn't have something to say or the church doesn't have something to say. Yeah. It's not that the church has nothing to say. It is that the church, but it's not that God's word has nothing to say. And this is what we keep coming back to. Every person, right? The educator, the lawyer, the doctor, all live coram Deo before the face of God, right?
Yeah.
So he summarizes this point. The quote I have that summarizes it is from 130. He says, the cosmos in all the wealth of the kingdom of nature was spread out before, under, and above man. This entire limitless field had to be worked. To this labor, the Calvinist consecrated himself with enthusiasm and with energy.
So good.
So good, yeah.
He says, Calvinism called Christendom back to the order of creation, replenish the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over everything that lives upon it. Christian life as a pilgrimage was not changed, but the Calvinist became a pilgrim who, while on his way to our eternal home, had yet to perform on earth an important task. Yep. So take dominion.
Yep.
And that's part of science, is learning how to. So then he goes on, for the earth with all that is in it had, according to God's will, to be subjected to man. Thus flourished in those days in my native country agriculture and industry, commerce and navigation as never before. This newborn national life awakened new needs. In order to subdue the earth, a knowledge of the earth was indispensable. Knowledge of its oceans, of its nature, and of the attributes and laws of this nature.
Right.
Boom.
Boom. So he leads into, and that kind of leads into this fourth point that he lands on, and that is that Calvinism solves the conflict of science.
Yes.
So when Kuyper's talking about the conflict of science, he's talking about the conflict sort of between naturalism and supernaturalism, or naturalism
and he calls
and
it
supernatural.
Normalist or abnormalist. Normalist being those who think the earth, basically an evolutionary mindset.
Right.
This is just the world the way it is, and it is slowly progressing.
Right.
On and on it goes.
And we would kind of, I don't know what categories might be most colloquial for our people, but you'd think like this is the difference between sort of materialism and spiritualism, or materialism, I guess, and faith, right? That he's kind of talking about there's a supernatural aspect to the world, and there's a natural aspect to the world.
Well, and he says there is no conflict between science and faith.
Right.
The difference is, well, he says they all have faith.
That's right.
Yeah, he said all of them have some kind of starting point of faith. And he says every science presupposes faith in self, in our self-consciousness, presupposes faith in the accurate working of our senses, faith in the correctness of the laws of thought. So he goes on and on. And I had just made a note. It says it's not science or faith. And I know Christians deal with this a lot.
Yes.
They're science deniers.
Right.
But it's either a godly science or an ungodly science.
That's right.
What's your starting point? Is your starting point that God is the creator who has worked in, like you said, his character, so there's natural laws that guide it, and because of the fall, it needs to be regenerated and renewed? That'd be the abnormalist. The world we have here is not what it was at the beginning.
Right.
Or are you, there's no creator, there's just kind of this infinite, right, where we came from ooze and it's just sort of developed over
right. Yeah, so I had a couple of quotes here for the two different, he says the normalists, this is on 132, reject the very idea of creation and can only accept evolution, while the abnormalists adhere to primordial creation over against an evolution in infinitum. So the idea here is it's a presupposition. Where do we come from? Where do we start from? Is sort of
that's that conflict, and that's the antithesis, right? That Kuyper talks about. There's just these two camps.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point. And you know, you said that they both require faith. I remember having a conversation with a friend who basically was just saying, like, I've never seen a miracle. Natural world, the things I can see, the things I can feel, like I get that. Like I can't live in a world where there's a supernatural and I don't have access to it. I don't know how it works, etc. Right? So that's why I have my feet firmly planted on the ground. I remember talking to him, and the what he had used was the virgin birth, right? Like I can't get over that. And it was the first time the phrase came to me about the virgin birth of the cosmos. I'm like, but you believe in the virgin birth of the cosmos? And he took a moment, and it's just like, right? Like at some point you believe that life arose from non-life. That takes a leap of faith that's greater, I think, than the leap of faith I'm taking when I say I believe that a God created it all, right? So you don't escape the necessity of a miracle. You don't escape the necessity of faith. All you're doing is, where is that faith derived from? From some faceless force, or from the God of the Bible. Yeah. Right.
And this was really helpful for today. In this paragraph at the bottom of 133, he talks about how the normalist, so let's say an evolutionist or an atheist today, if they in any way adopt any of the Christian ideas, or that the image of God is in man, or that there was a fall, he says he has become, like, he's forfeited his name as a scientist.
Right.
Like if you try to mix those two, you're done. And then he flips it and says, and on the other side, an abnormalist, and so a Christian, someone who believes in the Bible, believes God created it all, believes that man is made in the image of God, then tries to adopt some kind of evolutionary principle. He also is an amphibious scholar and forfeits the name of science. And that's prevalent today.
Big time.
The biologos trend of throwing evolution into the first chapters of the Bible.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen that hermeneutically, it's dangerous. Understanding how you interpret the Bible, it's not helpful.
And not only that, but I mean, again, it leads to the same sorts of conclusions, right? Because so there's a couple things that are major issues with that. And number one is sinful man always has a tendency to try to blend, right, the sin he loves with the God that he wants to love, right? And so I think that sort of amalgamation, we can believe in God, the God of the Bible, but also evolution, and therefore we look good to both camps, right? It's just sin. It's just a desire to look, have a
You're an
spot of the cool
amphibious
kids.
scholar, and
that's right. Yeah. And so there's that, but the other problem is that it all ends in the same direction, right? So when you look at what has been the effects of the rise of evolutionary theory and the rise of people believing in evolution? Depression, suicide, right? Abortion, euthanasia.
Right.
Well, you don't get around that with the biologos stuff. You don't get around the meaninglessness of things, right?
Yeah.
Because you might have a God of the gaps who fills in all the gaps of evolution, and that might seem like a really good way to explain away things. But at the end of the day, there's still a forcelessness to it, right? It's not the sovereign God of Calvinistic of a Calvinistic worldview who is directing all things, right?
Yeah.
So
that's really good. And so the reason why he says too here that Calvinism is what solves the conflict is that the Calvinist who understands that the world's fallen and needs to be regenerated can give freedom and liberty of thought, speech, press to those on the other side, because he can just understand it as someone whose thinking just needs to be submitted to the will of God, or someone who just needs Jesus. Right. Or whatever. And so you can allow them freedom, and that's fine. God will work in their life, and that's okay. But on the other side, they can't allow that.
Right.
Allowing you freedom of thought crumbles their thought.
Well, and this kind of comes back to I hope a very central takeaway that everybody who's going through these lectures is getting, and that is that submitting yourself to the truth of the Bible actually creates the most amount of liberty.
Yes.
And that
for society.
Yes. And it is a sign of maturity to be able to live and let live. I finished reading Chronicles of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe of Quinn. And at the end of the story, in the last chapter, it summarizes the reign of King Peter, Edmund, Susan, and Lucy. And it's really interesting because it talks about, how C.S. Lewis just summarizes their however many years of reign in Narnia. Yeah. And it says that they implemented righteous laws that allowed the people of Narnia to live and let live. Huh. And it dawned on me, because I'm going through all this Kuyper stuff, is just like, what do righteous laws look like? An ability for people to live and let live. And so you're talking about the conflict between the evolutionists and the creationists. There's one side that's trying to silence the other.
Yes.
The Christian side ought not to try to silence the other.
And he says it's happened in the past, and that was not good.
It wasn't good. That's exactly right. And the reason it wasn't good is because it always shows an insecurity in your own viewpoint when you try to silence the opposing.
Yeah, he says, may God grant it. You cannot, nay, you even may not think of it. Deprive him whose consciousness differs from you of freedom of thought, of speech, and of the press.
That's right.
It's like, don't do it.
Don't. Right. Yeah. Right.
Don't do it. And for any reason, practically, it'll just turn back on you when
power flips.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But the worldview doesn't even afford that, right? The worldview is one that the world's fallen and that people need to be regenerated. The whole world is being worked over by God's power, right? And through the centuries, it's progressing. It is getting better. Jesus' kingdom is spreading. And so the Calvinist, with his whole world and life view, can understand, give them freedom, live and let live,
right?
And we'll press on,
right?
Knowing,
because God has ordained all things,
Exactly.
which means also the movement of the molecules within his created order,
Right.
which means history is moving in a direction,
Yeah.
right? And he's in control of that too.
Yeah.
So it all comes together.
Yeah.
He kind of talking about how do we win this conflict. You're kind of talking about that a little bit there, but how is it he's basically, he says that if the church and the state withdraw from kind of the pursuit of science, in order that the university may be allowed to take root and flourish in its own soil, then certainly the division, which is already begun, will be accomplished of itself and undisturbed. And in this domain, also, it will be seen that only a peaceful separation of the adherents of the antithetic principles warrant progress, honest progress, and a mutual understanding. So he's basically talking about, again, the autonomy of the pursuit of science, and the necessity of the autonomy of the pursuit of science.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of goes back to what we were jumping ahead to, is like, what's our practical takeaway from this? Is if there's this conflict between the atheistic evolutionists and how they're doing science, the creationist Christians and how they're doing science, the reality is that the creationist Christian scientists ought to be better scientists, because they're observing the world and making assumptions within the world based on a predestining God.
Yeah, with the correct lens.
That's right.
Which is the word of God. There was a Calvin quote that Kuyper had in here. I didn't happen to pull it out, but that was what Calvin says about science is that they should be just doing it better because they are doing it through the lens of Scripture. And so they're going to be able to see the world clearer than an unbeliever would.
That's right. And I think that's like I used this analogy earlier, but I think this is a good like kind of practical application is, the Christian, medical researcher assumes that this, whatever disease he's working on, right? He makes a few assumptions. Number one, God created our bodies in order to fight diseases, and therefore, right? It's not always a vaccine problem. It's not always right. Like you trust the body that God gave us to last. And I know, like, obviously this year, this is a very timely thing, right? Because you have a lot of people who would say, oh, the way that science has advanced has advanced viruses beyond the point where the human body can kind of keep up with some of these viruses. Now, don't get me wrong. Vaccines are a good thing. Neither of us are anti-vaxxers in any way, shape, or form. But the point here is that this year, it really did kind of become a conspiracy theory to believe that our bodies would do what God designed them to do, and create immunity, and those sorts of things. But also, when there is a new disease or an old disease that there's not a cure for, the Christian medical researcher says we just haven't discovered enough yet. We got to go dig up more flowers. We got to, we got to check out more pollinated, whatevers.
Something.
We got to find something at the bottom of the ocean, right? Like this is. We got to figure this out, and it's the Christians who I remember watching some sort of documentary where they were going down into the Mariana Trench and this new sort of thing that could go down further than anything else, and they were sending down these cameras, and they were looking at some of these creatures that live so far down. That had never been seen before, right? You've seen those like translucent, like fish that you can see through and all that kind of stuff. They're just showing in, some of these newly discovered fish.
Sounds awesome. You need to send me the link to that.
But I remember sitting there and thinking like, the Christian looks down there and says, isn't that cool? No human eye has ever laid eye on this fish, and yet it's existed for however many thousand years, 6, and only for God. Right. Like God is the only one who's appreciated that design in His world up until now. Well, and he delighted in it you know what I mean?
Yeah. And He's just like, just wait till you guys develop the thing that can go even deeper and just see what I got down there.
Yeah. I got more stuff for you down there. But it's the Christian who goes down there and says, now that we're here, what's here that God intended for us to find that's going to help us with where we are in the world?
Right.
Because scientific discovery, scientific advancement, the movement of history, all under the sovereign predestination of God. So we interact with the world knowing that.
Yeah.
So
What else is there to take dominion of?
that's right. Right. What does it look like for us to find that fish down here that cures cancer up here?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So
It's cool.
yeah. I don't know. This was a good one.
It was. Like I said, it surprised me.
Yeah.
So I was happy. Happily surprised.
Anything else you wanted to pull out that I skipped past or anything?
No, I don't think so.
All
Next
right.
week is Calvinism and art.
Yeah. And
Cool.
and all equally surprising, actually.
Yeah.
I'm not much of an art guy, but I found myself really liking that lecture as well. So there's your little teaser for next week.
Got it. Cool.
Read it, listen to it, and join us next week for Calvinism and Art. Hope you're enjoying this. Reach out to us, ask your questions. We're enjoying going through this, but it's even more enjoyable when you interact with us. So do it, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.